this whole thing is weird, obviously. But
well, you're excited about being interviewed. That's neat.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Oh yeah, you are. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Hi, I'm Felicia.
I know. Great to see you.
I know. See you in person.
Indeed,
So nice emailing with you.
Exactly.
Greg.
Hey,
how's it
Greg.
going?
Yes. Glad to be up here with you too.
Yeah.
So I'm going to crash just the first couple of questions.
Right here.
There's water down there if you like it, Richard.
Great. Thank you. I will actually take you up on that since I've been out on the noisy floor,
Yes.
repeating things.
Have you been showing your game here, or?
Yeah. You know what's interesting is a habit I got into starting in the old days, which I think fits well with your sensibilities as well, even if you don't do this exactly the same way. I have always been my own pitch man for my games.
Yeah.
And I believe devoutly in that as a process. Because by being the pitch man, I know the game way better than any of the people they could hire at the booth. And by watching people's response to what I present, I can both see what they like or don't like in literally the game. And when I talk about the smoke and mirrors of things that are supposed to be there that I know I haven't implemented yet, I can also kind of see how people respond to those and refine them before I go implement them.
Right.
And so it's much better. Like, I don't like focus groups because you get biased information, I think. But watching the actual people doing the actual interaction with either the product itself or your ideas for the product, I think is invaluable.
Yeah.
So I actually enjoy. I'm always 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day, however long the shows are open, I'm always the person on the floor.
That's pretty cool. But also, it's like you're your best advocate because you know it the best.
You know it the best. You know what the intention is. You know the history.
And it's nice to brag about your stuff.
That's
it
true
just
too.
is.
No, I agree. I totally agree. And of course now I've been doing this long enough, to where it's we're on like generation 3 of gamers, I think now, and so it's hilarious to talk to young people who don't know that full history of things that to a lot of people might be insignificant, but like when I'm proudly displaying my past, I think they like invented the first role-playing games on a computer at all. Ultima 2, the first game in a box. Ultima 4, the first time there were things like virtues in a game. Ultima 5, the first time there were NPCs with schedules of day and night that did things. The term avatar, as an industry. The concept of and the term MMORPGs for when games became massively multiplayer. So anyway, there's all these kind of little moments or the word shard for server sets. That really is Ultima history.
Well, that's why we're here. Okay, so basically. Sorry. Do you need to do an intro or something?
I've been jumping in too ahead of questions.
Yeah, do you need to do an intro or?
Okay. Rolling.
Okay, basically.
Doing it live, yeah.
Okay, so I'm Felicia.
Yes.
This is Greg.
Greg.
Hello.
Pleasure.
Okay, and I'm here because I had dinner with Greg like 3 days ago when he first came to town. And he said that you were going to interview you, and I was like, oh my God, I have to be there. First of all, I wanted to meet you, and then second of all, the way we know each other is because of you.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Way back when.
Wonderful. Excellent. Well, it's a mutual admiration society too, just because what an amazing industry we are in, that we've seen the world around us change so much and been so fortunate to be part of those agents of change. I think it's just so exciting.
It's funny because the way we know each other is when we were 13 or 14, we connected on the Ultima Dragons Prodigy internet.
Yeah,
wars.
this is like early,
Oh,
early days of gaming communities on the internet and stuff.
Well,
like
Ultima
that.
Dragons is one of literally the first.
The first fan groups online, right? So I was Codex Dragon.
Sure. Yep.
And we connected because of our love of the game, but we loved Robert Jordan books. Like we love fantasy novels.
Yeah.
So we had like what do we have, like a private mailbox or something?
Yeah, there was like people were doing it was like early fan fiction, all this kind of stuff. People were just like expressing themselves.
I've seen
through,
your fan poetry.
Oh yeah, that was part of it. We would post our poetry about the Ultima game online, and you were a very good writer. Like you were one of the best, and that's why I was like, oh, well, I want to be that guy's friend.
Yeah.
So basically, I mean, that's how we know each other for like what, almost 20?
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Plus 18 years.
I know. You don't want to admit it.
And were you aware of that back then? Like, because you are now in the middle of doing the crowdfunding, interacting with the audience one-on-one. Were you aware that there was fandom?
Oh no, well, by the time of Ultima Dragons, absolutely.
Yeah.
For me, the journey switched with Ultima 3.
Right.
Akalabeth, Ultima 1, and Ultima 2 were published through other companies. And you sort of knew that they had to be hypothetically popular, but I didn't know how many like record sales meant a gold record. I assumed it was some very giant number. I mean, to this day, I'm not sure I actually know the answer to that question. But you know, the first Ultima, or Calibeth sold 30,000 units. But you know, that's just a number.
Yeah.
But there's nothing to compare it to.
Right.
So I didn't know any even book authors, so I don't know how many copies of a book sell or how many people watch a particular television show. And I'm 19 years old at the time. But I definitely didn't get any fan mail or any mail from anybody because it went to that other company.
Yeah.
And then by the time I got to Ultima 2, it was Sierra. But again, if anybody wrote there, I never saw it. And it wasn't until Ultima 3, which my brother and I published as Origin, where suddenly I started seeing letters that people would write in. And on the one hand, it was both, wow, people actually care enough to bother to write in. On the other hand, every letter I've ever received now by email, you know, old days on paper, which I love the paper ones because I still have them, it's almost always one paragraph of, hey, I really like your games, and for whatever a reason that they liked it. And then the rest of the page or pages is, let me tell you what you did wrong.
They would send you that in letter form?
To this day, that's what I get.
In letter form?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
You're getting trolled like old-fashioned.
Absolutely. And so 99% of the letters I get to this day are the same as the form I would get in the very beginning, which at first I wasn't exactly trying to take that, because you're like, wow, do they like the game or do they not? But then, you know, 1% of the letters I would get would be crazy people. I mean, literally people who have lost touch with reality. I actually just got one of those by Twitter now. I had somebody, you know, try to pitch me, you know, based on their assumption of both my gaming and my space stuff that I do. They pitched me on the fact that they, of course, know how to make actual flying saucers and want me to invest in the, you know, $50 million in their let's get off the planet with their flying saucer technology.
Okay, sounds great.
It's, you know, mildly coherent, you know, through the letter that. I saw that I went to his Twitter feed and saw he also sent it to Bill Gates and Michael Dell and a few others.
Did it make you feel less special?
Yeah, exactly. It did. I was like, oh, he just can hit me up on the list.
When I do that, when someone really like rags on me, I always, and this is terrible because you're reinforcing bad behavior, because you're never like, oh, that's a compliment, let's see who else they compliment. No, you're like, that guy told me the worst things in the world. Let me go see who else he's insulting.
yeah, exactly.
And usually there's like a theme. It's a theme
There
of
is,
insult, and
there
it's like,
is.
oh, this is a bad person. The worst part is if they're like a normal person, then they just send like, I hate your work.
Right, because then you go like, wow, I really have done something to offend them.
Wow, really? This is a normal person I might have liked.
Now I should feel bad. now I must have really done something wrong. Yeah.
And what do you think about the, like you've gone through the whole crowdfunding situation where you kind of like because I just did that too with tabletop, and it's like you kind of let the walls down a lot.
Right, it was very scary.
Yeah.
It was very scary going into it, even though I had some friends who had gone ahead and were successful. And so I had some reason to believe that we would do fine through that process also. You know, since we knew the one thing we really wanted to do is go back and build the spiritual successor to Ultimas, which means if that's what we pitched and the crowdfunding didn't work, we would never be able to take that pitch back to a traditional publisher because they'd have evidence that it wasn't a good idea. And so we're going like, okay, well, this is a one-time shot thing. If this actually doesn't work, it's almost a career ender, or at least it's the all things Ultima are really over. I mean, you know, it was almost dead already because, you know, people like EA have not allowed it to continue, or neither with or without me really continued it. But it sort of would really permanently put a stop to that. So it was a hugely emotionally big decision for me to choose to try it. And it was a gigantic relief that it not only worked, but it worked well and has continued to work. So, you know, we put out a $1 million Kickstarter. We made 2 through the 30 days. We've made another 2 since that. And it's interesting because, you know, you put such a push on to get everybody in that 30-day window. That
yeah, it's like the U-curve they tell you about. You're like, you're going to die in the middle, but then you go back up.
Yes, and then once it closes, though, you go to another lull.
Yeah.
Right.
But if we do offline raising like we have, it slowly picks back up. But then we did our pricing change at the end of a year to where you get in now or it's going to end. So we had a big pickup right at the end of our first year and then a lull.
It's really smart.
And now it started picking back up again. But when you go into those lulls, you're going like, have they quit caring? You know, or is this really the end?
Did you guys ever think about crowdfunding anything? I mean, in the future?
We're fortunately in a position to not have to at the moment, just because we like kind of working in the dark without the pressure of a lot of people kind of influencing our early decisions. So I find I have the greatest respect for games that come through that process, because it seems so difficult to kind of work while the spotlight is shining on you in those early days, especially.
But what's interesting is I actually now like it better, and here's my reason for making that argument is. In the early Ultimas, I was not taking anybody else's money. I was just doing myself in my parents' closet. You know, I mean, it literally was free. You know, to develop. But once you start taking advances, even from your own company, you now really are beholden to other people. And especially once you've sold your company to another company, you now have a whole other set of personalities that you're beholden to.
Yeah.
And the only two products I'm disappointed in the launch of were the products I shipped immediately after selling my company to another company. And it's not because those companies are evil, it's because their agenda is not your agenda.
Right.
And you try to actually be nice to that company, and you allow yourself to make decisions that are not just your own pure thoughts of between you and or your users.
Right.
And crowdfunding is going straight to your users. There's no other personality other than the people who you really want to make excited about it who are in the mix. And at least for me, I'm way happier trying to make those people happy, my people, our people happy, than a salesperson in an organization who really isn't a fan of my games.
Right.
But do you think all that influence creatively, how do you quiet the world in order to make sure that it's your vision versus like the tainted vision of everyone's input, like pushing you? You know what I'm saying?
What's interesting is, I would actually say we have an anti-problem on that. And what I mean by that is, like I've been very public about, Ultima's 1, 2, 3 were Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Time Bandits, all thrown in the game because those things inspired me when I was a teenager. Ultima 4 is the first time I said, okay, there's no hobbits in my world. There probably shouldn't have been to begin with, but
that was the first one I played.
Yeah, so Ultima 4 was when the world became my own.
Yeah.
And there were also no elves, although, but over the years I said, look, I don't mind taking trappings of historical fantasy, but I'd rather invent my own history, even for elves, if we were to have elves. But there weren't elves and dwarves, and definitely not hobbits, because those aren't even historical. Those were a ripoff. And so people have heard me say that, and so now I wanted to reintroduce elves in Shroud of the Avatar. And so people are going like, well, wait a minute, you've made this stance against elves. And I'm going, no, I didn't make a stance against elves, I made a stance against arbitrarily adding things that are somebody else's IP. The way I've introduced elves is with a piece of fiction that I have created. And so when I'm changing my own mind about my own things, if our fan base interprets that someone on the team has overruled me on what they believe is my longtime stance, they get angry. I have to convince them, no, this is my idea, or I really have endorsed this. It's okay, don't worry. But it's rare that the audience has ever tried to get me to deviate from things I've said.
Yeah.
If anything, they've made it very clear, we're backing you on this project because we want you to do it the way you would do it, not the way even your other partners would do it, but specifically, the way I did it in its purest original form, which may or may not be an accurate interpretation.
Okay, can I ask one last question, then I'm going to get out of here, because this is your interview. I'm so sorry.
It's awesome.
I can't even tell you how much an influence as a kid the character generation in your game made on me, because the virtues literally were such
the fortune teller.
Oh god, the fortune teller thing I was obsessed with. I mean, I was always obsessed with like personality games as well. But like that's so revolutionary, and it's like an emotional way to create your character versus a external way, which is basically almost all games now. And do you think there's a possibility of people being more innovative in that world, or is it just like everything is?
We're going back to that also with Shroud of the Avatar, something very much like it. And for me, how that came about, starting with Ultima 4, was I said, and it goes back to those letters that I received on Ultima 3 when I realized, I was doing a game where I just assumed everybody was being the good guy.
Right.
Even though I put in the ways to steal from shops, and was kind of ignorantly unaware that if you put in the way for people to steal from shops, that's of course what they'll do. And but when I started reading the feedback letters, we were like, everyone is playing that way. Everyone is being the roguish Conan the Barbarian type. No one is actually being the hero. And I thought, oh well, that was an unintended consequence. And I said, well, how should I feel about that? Because I think it's perfectly fine. Even like Grand Theft Auto, I'm going, if your role in a role-playing game is to be the bad guy, well then be the bad guy. Right. But if you're supposed to be the hero, well then you ought to be judged based on how well you're actually playing that role. And so I said, okay, well then in that case it's important to me that you're not role-playing Conan the Barbarian, even if you create a character named Conan.
Right.
It's you. And the only way for me to make you responsible for the moral decisions that you make is to find a way that's you, not Conan. And that's what's really started that whole character creation path, is I had to figure out a way to make you feel like you're responsible for the actions of that character, which is why you had to have the moon gate that takes you there, so you're transported, and you might remanifest as a new avatar, which is where the term avatar came from. Even that word, I didn't. There was no one previously using that in games. That came when I was doing research on virtue, and by doing a lot of religious study.
It's like the
and the Ankh was actually from a different sort. The Ankh honestly was from Logan's Run.
Oh,
it's really where I got that from, to be honest. But I found that Sanskrit word avatar, which was, and this is before Google, of course. I mean, in dictionaries or more importantly, out of physical encyclopedias, found the term for the manifestation of a deity on Earth. So Vishnu as an elephant on Earth is his avatar. And I went, well, that's the term I need. This is your manifestation into the virtual world.
Yeah, cool word too.
Yeah.
It is. Well, it's amazing. And quite frankly, I literally wouldn't have a career without Ultima. Because Codex, anything with the guild or anything with gaming was because I fell in love with the Ultimate games. So thank you for...
No. Thank you. Thank you for the kind words. And really, I would love to reverse this. If there's... I've been dying to find a way to get on your shows.
Tabletop. I'm going to have you on Tabletop. It will happen.
And you've had like Steve Jackson and a lot of my other friends from Austin on the shows. And I've been so jealous.
Promise that
seriously.
We are making it happen season 3 with Tabletop.
Perfect.
Okay, well thanks for letting me crash, and I'm sure you're going to have some awesome stuff I'll love to watch later.
Now for the boring part of the interview. Yeah, thanks. That's amazing. I never knew that that Ultima 4. That's very interesting. Makes a lot of sense that kind of system would come from the feedback you were getting on 3, and just an extension of what players were already doing.
Yeah, and it's because it's the first time I actually knew what players were doing.
Right.
Prior to that moment, I literally had no clue.
Yeah.
And in fact, part of the feedback in Ultima 3, just as an odd side note, somebody wrote in, I really love this game. It was really cool how, I was trying to fight the dragon with the big sword that I found and I couldn't do it, so I switched to the dagger and I killed the dragon. Yeah. It was so brilliant of you to make this weird Easter egg that the only way to kill the dragon was with a dagger. And I'm going, that does not sound right.
Yeah.
So I went into the code and I looked at the damage routines and go like, how in the world does this guy kill a dragon with a dagger?
Yeah.
And actually what I found out in Ultima 3 was it didn't actually matter what weapon you used. Literally, whether you used the dagger or the sword, your character's level and attributes made the difference. Yeah. So you still felt like as you're progressing through the game, you got stronger because you did.
Yeah.
It just had nothing to do with the weapon you were
That's
wielding.
Funny.
And these are the only things you find out because again, back in those days there was no QA department.
Yeah.
Nothing was online. You were your own QA. So yeah.
Do you find it? I've often wondered if it's kind of gone full circle in some respects to. Maybe not back how it was then, but at least more like the late '80s or something when team sizes are smaller now, I think on average, than they were 5 years ago or something. A lot of big studios have been closing. These smaller independent studios are springing up. So do you feel any of that?
Oh, absolutely, and I completely agree with it. It's a profoundly important change. Yeah. The other direction, so to speak, was not sustainable.
Right.
But how we got there was understandable. I mean, you've got this Moore's Law problem of computers get more and more sophisticated.
Right.
And therefore, the tools you use to make the first games aren't good enough to make the second. In fact, Ultimas were founded on the fact that from Akalabeth to Ultima 1 through Ultima 7, really through 9, virtually no engine was used between them. So we reinvented everything
they were huge
from scratch.
Changes. Yeah.
Well, the good news was that meant your game was measurably better. Yeah. Not only was it design-wise hopefully better, but even technically it was better. And so that reinvention of the camera is great as long as the team size is small enough and the computers are small enough to make that a practical thing to undertake. Right. We're now to the point where that is not just slightly impractical, it's utterly impractical. Yeah. The fact that in a post-Worlds of Warcraft MMO era, we've had 3 or more multi-$100 million games with hundreds of people involved in them that have done terribly. Right. Almost returned close to zero on their hundreds of millions of dollars investment. Just demonstrates the fact that there's just no reason anybody should start down that path again.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I look at we're using Unity now, and it's the first time I've used another engine. And the thing that convinced me was not because I thought that I needed to go find another engine. Mm-hmm. It's that when you build an engine from scratch for your purposes, usually the engine does its job, but the tools the developers have to use are what's usually not that great.
Right.
And it's not sustainable for use by anybody else.
Yeah.
Unity is such a good pipeline from head to toe that I realized I can actually use those tools. I mean, I can't use my own tools usually.
Right.
And the fact that I can sit down with Unity and create again alongside my other developers suddenly meant that now I'm not just a manager anymore. I'm now back to being a creator again.
Yeah,
And
that
it's
must feel
very,
good.
Very good. It feels very powerful again.
My little anecdote is, it was when I was playing Ultima 4 when I was like 8 years old that I decided that I want to make games when I grow up. I don't know how a human being made this, but someone must have made this somehow, and it was just a profound experience that stuck with me ever since. And it actually took me a while to get into game development, but I finally did, and I felt now I'm with a small team. We're 12 people, and it's really. But before that, I worked at EA with like 100, right? And that sense that an individual's contribution can be a greater part of the whole is very powerful.
Well, I totally agree. And even like we're at 30 people right now, and I can already feel a little bit of inefficiency creep in. And so I'm going like, okay, we can't bring another person on.
That's the catch.
That's it. Yeah. Just because I'd rather find some other solution or do something else than bring on any statistically much more, if any, above 30.
Right.
Just because back on each of my last few games, I was not just the manager, I was the manager of the managers managing the people.
Right.
And so you're so disconnected.
Right.
And there's so many eddies and turbulence of gaps where things just don't get done, or duplicated behavior, or you really have no idea if this person's been performing or not because you don't really interact with them. It's just a bad idea.
Yeah.
And I think there's much better.
What's the biggest team size you've ever worked on?
We had 300 to 400 people at peak in both Ultima Online as well as Tabula Rasa.
Yeah. For an MMO, it makes sense.
But we're going to build a game that is at least as big as UO with 30 people.
And these days, with stuff like Unity,
right?
Asset store.
That's really the reason why. I look at it and go, not having to build the engine saves us one big chunk. Having the community do crowdsourcing of not just the asset store type stuff, but music and even things that build a coat of arms for people that directly important in the game, tools the community has built,
right?
Things like cloth simulators that people in the community have built that we get credit for. Shows up their game, people are like, "Wow, you guys are brilliant! You made this great cloth simulator." We're going like, "Yeah, okay, well, somebody just gave it to us." That's really just saving enormous amounts of time and effort. Yeah,
that's amazing. You could and the fact that you're back in there making content. It sounds
it's interesting too. Like the last. As I look at the stories of Ultimas, the thing that drove you to hopefully appreciate the intellectual property, Ultimas 4 and 5 at least I wrote basically by myself. Starting with 6 and 7, I wrote with Warren Spector as a writing partner, who I think is brilliant, and I think those are the best told stories in Ultimas when I had a really good writer as a writing partner. Ultimas 8 and 9, I was really out of the writing job. Again, was the manager of the managers. I was getting too far away from it, from my own flavor, my own preference, and I think that even shows in the games. For this game, for Shroud of the Avatar, me and Tracy Hickman, who's obviously a very good writer, not only drafted the story of the prequel book that we wrote together, but the main story for Shroud of the Avatar. I have poured through every NPC and every line of conversation, beginning to end, 3 times already before it's even handed off to the guy that's going to write the actual prose. And so this story I know intimately. I have fine-tuned it personally, intimately, and so I have high confidence that it's going to meet at least the expectations of people. It'll be a Richard Garriott story, because it is. A
fascinating thing about Ultima for me was always that it like balanced. It's very open in its structure. You just start the game and you could go in any direction and so on, and yet there is a crafted story there. So there's always like an eternal debate in the game industry, is like, should stories attempt to tell crafted stories, or should it be all about the player's story and not have any kind of crafted narrative in there? And from my point of view, it's kind of a nonsensical debate, because there have been games like Ultima all along that show that you can have both.
And I agree. But I obviously prefer both as well. But I understand the difficulty of it. I mean, it's and especially once you make it multiplayer, then it's profoundly difficult. Although we're trying to do that here with Shroud of the Avatar. But like Ultima Online benefited from having the virtue history of Ultima, but it didn't really have much story actually in it. But people often felt that it had the ambiance of the story of the predecessors. With Shroud of the Avatar, we're actually trying to do both at the same time. Create a really compelling sandbox to go anywhere you want, anytime you want, with a compelling story that is very personal, that has not just one way to go through it, that you can choose the light path or the dark path, so to speak, and that your choices along that way have consequences that manifest to you and your party members and the world around you, and yet are done in a multiplayer, story. So I think we've got that nailed. That's,
you certainly have
we'll see.
some experience doing it. So
but it is new even for us. So that's if I actually said there was the biggest risk in our plan, it's pulling off the things we've never done before, including things like this selective multiplayer we're doing, where you can kind of dial up how open or solo player you'd like the experience to be.
Yeah, since you've been on both sides of that. Yeah, I was it was interesting because Ultima Online obviously reached a massive number of more people than your previous games, and then but for people who've been playing, who were so used to kind of the intimacy of the single player experience, it was very different. So the fact that you're kind of trying to reconcile both at
the same time is a challenge, because in our community we have two types of followers. We have the people who started with UO, so that's really all they know.
Yeah.
And so they have no reason to be interested in the solo player type experience or the story-driven experience. Then we have people who like the storytelling experience of the previous Ultimas but didn't see it in UO.
Right.
And so they're going, I really want that first one, but I'm worried that having a multiplayer game is going to spoil the fact that I missed that in UO and I liked it in the solo player games.
Yeah.
And we're constantly trying to tell people, I think we can give you both at the same time. And not just by turning the switch of which one you want to play, but I mean, we can integrate them into a single experience. But jury's out. They're understandably somewhat concerned.
Yeah.
We haven't proven it, but I have a belief we can do it, and we'll see.
I mean, you've I'm sure part of what must drive you to keep doing this is exploring the unknown, as it were. If you were just doing stuff that you'd already done before.
Of course, and that's what keeps it interesting and exciting is what things do you purposefully tear down? What trappings do you purposely forego?
Right.
For example, in the earliest Ultimas, when you talk to NPCs and they'd give you a clue, you had to write it down.
Yeah.
And if you went through a dungeon, there was no auto map. You drew it out on paper. And in order to try to make the game appeal to people who weren't that hardcore, role-playing games all began to put in things like auto mapping.
Yeah.
And then after that, they went to menu-based conversations. And after that, you did things like have quest logs. And after quest logs, you began to put arrows on the map to tell you where to go.
Yep.
And then to know who to talk to, they began to put exclamation points over people's heads. And the result of that, each of those steps happened for a justifiable purpose to help bring in more people.
Yeah.
But the result is that the gameplay is basically brain dead in most every role-playing game.
Right.
Most people don't even read line 1 of the text. They just click on everything till it's done because they know the quest log is what's important. The conversation is literally irrelevant.
Right.
And so they behave that way. And so we're like, okay, how can we not go so old school that we force people to do things they're not going to want to do, yet also not make a brain-dead game for the player? Because I think people will appreciate getting the support tools they need to play efficiently.
Right.
But not take away their need or desire to participate in what's happening.
Right. Yeah, and actually engage with it. And
right.
You were talking about, with the character creation in Ultima 4 and so forth. You're trying to get the player invested in their decisions kind of from the start.
Exactly.
When did it occur to you that the games you were making could have this kind of like rather intense kind of emotional impact on players? Like, was it with Ultima 3 or was it more?
It was 4.
Yeah.
It really was 4.
Because 4 was more configured around.
Yeah. In Ultima 4, I got the first of some very different. While most letters I still get are that same way I was describing, which are they're one paragraph of I like and the rest of what you did wrong. Ultima 4 did engender a whole new kind of feedback.
Yeah.
And my favorite letter from the Ultima 4 era is from a mother who was buying a game for their daughter. Had heard of Ultima but had never really seen one. Bought their daughter Ultima 4, but being a responsible adult wanted to play alongside their child playing games. And said, even though they didn't buy Ultima 4 for any particular positive purpose, when they played it, they said, our daughter had problems with things like shoplifting and other social issues. And she said as she watched her daughter play Ultima 4, she noticed that my daughter could manifest some of those same behaviors, and of course did. But then began to see the actual rational ramifications of doing those behaviors meant that people would not help you going forward, which is exactly what I designed into Ultima 4.
Right.
And the mother was just, stunned that a game could not only care to bother to put that in, but represent it in a way that showed her child the rational outcome of that behavior, and actually changed the child's outlook on important social issues going forward. And so it was probably the most gushingly, what a great discovery that parent had made, and how important it was for her and her child. And so for me, it became to this day probably the favorite letter I've ever received from games.
Did you have any idea that it was kind of capable of that before you started getting that kind of feedback? Or
no. I mean, what's interesting is my favorite Ultimas, Ultima 4, Ultima 7, Ultima Online. Those games, no one had faith that they were going to be any good around me. Not my team members, my parents, my brother, my business partner. The feedback I was regularly getting is, Richard, why are you going way off the deep end to do this kind of preaching stuff? People like running around killing everything, stealing everything. That's clearly the behavior they enjoy. They're telling you they're enjoying it. You're doing a big risk to try to force people to do something that's not the behavior they're telling you they like. Is a bad or at least dangerous decision. But I just felt compelled to do it. I just thought, this is the purity of what I think I want to say, and so come hell or high water, we're going to do it. And the same thing was true for Ultima 7. We had this purity of detail of interaction of the virtual world we really wanted to accomplish, and it took us a lot longer than we hoped, and people were upset with us about wasting all this time, and why does a light switch need to turn on off the light? There's no gameplay difference, so why is it important? I mean, it's important because it's the purity of everything that is interactive should do as you would expect it. And that allowed me to take 10% of those and make plot points out of them, but you had to make it work, all of it had to operate, not just the one thing that mattered. And then the first MMO, again, no MMOs had really been successful previously at the scale of massive. And so everyone was against it. Everyone was against spending millions of dollars to create a game that there had been no precedent of sales to support that level of investment. But we just had faith that it was the right thing to do.
I was just about to ask, I suppose you just answered, but I was curious as to how you work through that kind of, when there is that kind of negativity, whether that, I think for myself, it can almost be motivating in some weird way. Like I like, the more people think something can't happen, the more you kind of become emboldened
when you have important people about you arguing against you, at least pay attention to it. But it is interesting, and again, this may not be proper thinking, but I have data to support that the 3 games that I had the most critical feedback amongst people close to me, but had confidence in myself and did it, Ultima 4, Ultima 7, Ultima Online, did the best of all Ultimas. The 2 times I actually listened to people's feedback and took things out of the game or changed the process of creation to match my new overlord employees were the ones that did the worst. And so, while it could be anecdotal and there may or may not be any statistical real relevance to it, it definitely reinforces my belief of, sure, listen, but don't do anything unless you're convinced. I mean, if it's your responsibility to make it right, stand by what you believe and do it the way you think it should be, and then live or die by the consequences. The worst thing is to give up on your ideals and then get crucified for it. Then you're going like, oh, that was a loss followed by a loss. It's not only a tragedy didn't work out well, but you feel so bad about yourself for having allowed it, because it was in a sense an unforced error.
You gave up your own standard at that point. Having worked with teams of such different sizes, you must deal with that all the time, where there's just kind of difference of opinion on the team, and how do you kind of negotiate your way through that and kind of keep plugging forward?
Well, it's interesting because I think that I'm infamous for my strong opinion about the difficulty of finding or growing or being a good game designer. I think our industry is full of great artists, full of great programmers, but is not full of great game designers. But there are others. There's many. There's people like Chris Roberts, who I think is a great game designer, did the Wing Commander series. And Chris's method of achieving that through a team is that Chris, when he comes up with his ideas, by the time he shows it to anybody else, he's worked it through in great detail in his head. And when he describes to the team or management what this is where we're going, I listen to that articulation of going, he's right. It's brilliant. And if people just execute, it will be great. And he hires people who will execute. And if you don't execute the way he wants, you're not part of his team. And it may seem cruel and dictatorial, which it sort of is, but it works because the purity of his vision is right on.
Right.
I don't have that skill. My skill is I sort of know the goalposts, but I need to feel it as it's being implemented. And sometimes I'm wrong, and we need to back up. I can't see that far over the horizon for whatever reason. But I also know I can feel it when it's right. And so it's slower, it's messier, it is a bit more democratic, but democratic in the sense of everybody has a voice, but I still never let something through that I'm not personally convinced is part of the whole. And it's that filter, the fact that I am the true filter. Nothing goes, except for those 2 occasions, nothing goes past me that doesn't add up in my mind to this perfect puzzle, is what works for me.
Yeah.
But again, everybody, all great designers have a different way.
On our team, it's all it's very collaborative, which is possible when it's just a small group of people who all have to kind of buy into each other's ideas anyway to move forward.
And I think by working in a small team, especially if there's people you've worked with before, you sort of know the other people's strengths, weaknesses, and biases.
Right.
And so I know that if I leave a system up to one particular person, which way it will deviate from what I would have done myself.
Yeah.
And sometimes you go, that's all right, because it's something where you find that that's an acceptable part of the whole. Ultima 4 was the last game I did entirely, basically by myself. Ultima 5 was the first time I had a team of programmers.
Right.
Very painful process. It was easy to give up art because I was never a good artist. It was easy to give up music. Of course, I was never a musician. But giving up programming was more of a, being the only programmer, shifting to a team was much more emotionally trying.
Because there's more of a gray area between how you divvy up that work and everything, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So
well, and also this first time that while I was never a good artist and never a good musician, I fancied myself, and I think I was an acceptably good programmer.
Right.
And so when other people start playing in the code, it suddenly meant that it wasn't the same as I would do. It wasn't necessarily better, it wasn't necessarily worse, but it was definitely not the same.
Yeah.
Whereas the art was always much better, and the music was always much better. And so that was the first time you go like, well, am I settling or not to allow it to be different? And sometimes you were settling, and sometimes it was way better.
Yeah.
At this point, though, all the coders we employ are infinitely better than I ever was, so that's no longer an issue.
I believe you got started making RPGs in part playing lots of D&D and stuff like that in the past. Do you still play D&D or anything like that?
Off and on. And so, I don't play it a ton. I play at least a couple times a year.
Yeah, that's good.
But I still love tabletop gaming. So I think, and what's interesting about tabletop gaming in my mind is that it had a dead decade in my mind, maybe ending about 5 years ago. There was it kind of rose to a point, maybe the first peak might have been, Magic the Gathering or something. So, somewhere around there it kind of reached a little bit of a crescendo, but then really nothing happened in my mind for maybe a decade. And so I didn't play any tabletop gaming really of any kind, whether old traditional board game or newfangled, role-playing-ish kind of game. But then in the last 5 years, I've seen some really, really good games come up. And not only is traditional, quote-unquote, traditional Dungeons and Dragons good fun still, but a lot of other games that circulate through the office that I just sit down and play with people that are things you can play in over a lunch break that are still role-playing-ish, still very strategic, thematically very powerful, really tight rule sets. Things been going like, this is a really well-designed product. Yeah. And I think it's exciting that pen and paper games are kind of seeing a new renaissance.
Yeah. Why do you suppose that is? Is it back to the thing that just kind of small groups of people can make this stuff happen again, or?
I think it's similar. I think that's a piece of it. I think if you go back to Dungeons and Dragons, Dungeons and Dragons started as a pretty simple rule set, became giant and bloated. Yeah. Has simplified some, but it's still sort of large.
Yeah.
But a lot of the best new games, while they still have the feel of a full-blown role-playing game, they're really constrained rules and constrained play cycles and times. Right. And I think that is much more fitting with modern sensibilities of people have a lunch break, but they don't have time for a 2-week campaign.
Yeah, or like set aside their whole day for a crazy tabletop war game or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think they're better games. I think these really are. The art form is better.
So having come from like D&D, and you mentioned things like Star Wars and Time Bandits, I think at the same time Ultima, once it gained its own fiction, it took on this identity of like that's the first game I played that felt like it was more than just fun, right? It was saying something, it meant something. Did that become part of your own mental process of like going from, if you started kind of creating entertainment, did it ever stop being kind of entertainment in your mind, or transformed to something?
I still describe it as entertainment because I don't want to feel like I'm burdened with needing to be more than that.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely motivated by more than that.
Right.
In my heart of hearts, down deep somewhere.
Yeah.
If I analyze role-playing games, I think role-playing games have an interesting opportunity. If you think about learning and education of any topic, role-playing is often a big part of what makes it work well.
Right.
Little kids playing Tea Party or Army Men are role-playing and learning about how to interact with people socially. When I want to do something like, fortunately, very rarely ever had to fire anybody. But as part of EA, though, we had to fire people regularly because that's the EA way. And but I would often role-play that tough discussion with HR before having a face-to-face, because I learned early on when you go fire somebody for no particularly good reason, they're often very upset about it and
Who knew?
And mount counter arguments and are often pissed off or sad. And role-playing that ahead of time helps you figure out how to make that less traumatic for both you and that other person. And so role-playing is useful. And so I think role-playing games even have this, I don't think it's a moral responsibility, but it's an opportunity.
Yeah.
That you can do things like put in virtues and showcase those rational responses, and people have their own aha moment about it. And I realized that I then had a platform that I could take on other social issues that I thought were worth exploring and discussing, and put them in as a subtext of a plot. As I go through Ultimas 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, I can tell you what social issue is happening in the world that I was trying to parallel, that unless I tell you, you might not see it.
Yeah.
For example, with Ultima 6, the False Prophet, the cover of the game is the Avatar standing triumphantly with his foot on the chest of a writhing gargoyle.
Yeah, gargoyle. Yeah.
And the gargoyles were set up at the beginning of the game to be capturing you and about to kill you. And when you are rescued, they're invading Britannia, and you're set up to see them as horned, leathery winged, red, demonic, fanged creatures out to kill you and everything you know and love. But as you play the game, you realize that in fact they have families and literature, and if what you do is exterminate them, you basically have lost. And instead, if what you do is realize that their beef with you and your kind has at least a justification, if it's not entirely accurate, then you learn that bigotry that you and it's really funny in this modern age. We always try to say, people even say, racism is no more. Well, of course, you and I know there's still plenty of racism in the world. But I would also argue that we're all capable, just like those experiments where they take college kids and teach them to be jail guards and find out that pretty much anybody can ultimately be cruel.
Right.
I think all of us, in fact, do carry biases around that if you see something that is leathery and red and horned and fanged, you assume it's the bad guy.
Yeah.
But if we meet aliens from another planet that might be that look, there's really no reason we should assume that.
Exactly.
And so these were fun topics for me to bring back into games.
Yeah, I remember that vividly in Ultima 6, and in fact, the first game we worked on as a studio, Bastion, does something very similar with sort of a cultural kind of ethnocentric viewpoint taught to kind of you're taught that a certain group of people is the kind of antagonist or whatever. These are the enemy of your people, but
and I also really enjoy pushing people out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
I think that most people grow up believing and having the biases of their parents.
Yeah.
A great case study is most people are the religion of their parents, even though, and myself, I'm not a religious person, but even if you are, it's clear that not all of them could be right. And so therefore, 80% of people, if not 100% of people, are wrong.
Yeah.
And so I'm going like, at the very least, people should be pushed out of their comfort zone. They should be forced to confront what I think is a data truth, to at least question their own assumption that they just grew up believing, and instead make a choice on their own as to whether something is right, wrong, or otherwise. And so like in Ultima 8, when I started doing things like putting pentagrams on the cover, it's because, role-playing games were always, picked on for being, converting their children to devil worship and all this kind of stuff. And of course I know that's wrong, and all of my games are all the things about virtue, but I also know that anybody that actually thinks my game is about devil worship is not one of my players. And so I purposefully put pentagrams in my game and on the cover to go, you know what, if this pushes you out of your comfort zone, then you should be pushed out of your comfort zone. Only to find out that places like Walmart wouldn't take the game. They wouldn't put it on store shelves. So we had to produce a version of it with a wrapper on it that hid the pentagram, or they wouldn't put it on the store shelf.
How could you even hide? How could you hide the pentagram? It's like the whole.
Well, because the cover had the flames but no pentagram. So
okay. That's funny.
There's a special version for Walmart.
So that's very interesting as far as you're working on these things that can cause people to challenge their preconceptions. Why use games to do that? Well, among all the other ways to kind of.
Well, first of all, it's a lot more convenient than traveling to the Middle East and putting yourself in actual danger to go explore a different culture. But it also allows you to explore these things in a much more tangible way than just reading it. And so it lets you experience it in a way that I think has a deeper impact than just reading it. When I can force you to make that unforced error of being a bigot, and you realize, I don't think I was, but actually under the right circumstances, I actually might be. Those things are very powerful personal moments. And I think for me, what really hit it home when it actually happened on Ultima 4, when Ultima 4 was about to be released, my brother had a letter from one of our QA people who was almost all the way through. It was in the last dungeon of Ultima 4. And they saw the room full of children in cages, and they pulled a lever in the center of the room that released the children. But the children were monsters, and so they swarmed around you and attacked you. And I knew that you're the avatar, so you're going to be at this quandary of, what do I do? Because if I kill the children, I might lose a point of my virtue, and I'll have to start over. And so, but by the way, I also knew that there really was no test. They really were monsters, and so it was okay. But I knew that you wouldn't know that as a player, as to whether I had a test built there or not. And so just thinking it was a quandary was enough for me, and I put it in the game. Well, this QA person wrote a letter to my brother, said, I refuse to work for a company that so clearly supports child abuse, because I went into this room where I had to be physically abusive to children. And my brother came to me and he said, Richard, what in the hell have you done in the game? And at first I'm going like, I have no idea what this guy's talking about. And we had to go ask, and there was the room I just described. And I went, well, first of all, they're wrong. Because you don't have to throw the lever, you can put them to sleep, you could charm them. There's all kinds of things you can do not to hurt the children, if that's what you're really worried about. On the other hand, the fact that I've provoked this incredibly profound emotional reaction that came to this letter that is going to quit the company because of this belief, I was proud of. I actually said, I have provoked a reaction unlike any game before in history. There's no way I'm taking this out. And my brother's like, I won't publish it unless you take it out. And I'm going like, well, I'm not taking it out, so you're not publishing the game. And my brother got my parents involved, who are our investors. And usually my mom would always, we'd have these arguments a lot, but my mom always agreed with me, and my dad always agreed with my brother. But in this case, my mom agreed with them. And you're going like, Richard, it's just not worth it. You get good housekeeping against you and all this kind of stuff. It's going to be a big issue if you leave this in the game. And I said, you're all wrong. This is a really good thing to put in this game. I'm not taking it out. And so it ended up going out in the game, published, and no one ever noticed. No one ever commented on it, ever, good, bad, or otherwise, honestly. But that moment, the fact that I knew that these sort of vignettes were capable of provoking that kind of reaction, suddenly put me on a quest to do it on purpose. And so I then began to say, okay, what can I do? What scene can I set that will provoke a strong emotional response, good, bad, or otherwise, and then I'll see how to frame it in a way that I think is appropriate for the game.
Still doing that to this day.
Yeah. And by the way, ever since Ultima 4, there is the homage to killing children. And there's a web a blogger, a guy named Spoonie, who has noted this. And he's like, Richard, what is up with you and slaughtering children? Every one of your games, I get caught in a situation where I'm having to slaughter innocent children. What kind of sicko are you? And which I think is hilarious, because he's also a fan of the games, and he understands why I did it. But again, it's just one of these examples of, at this point it's just an Easter egg. But it's an homage to the moment when I started doing this on purpose.
Yeah, no, it's kind of the strongest, most intense moral quandary situation, right?
Right. Well, in fact, in Shroud of the Avatar, I have a much worse one that I probably shouldn't tip here, so I won't. But I'll kind of allude to
something
it
to
only
look
slightly.
forward to.
Yes, but yeah, there's a dungeon that you go into in Shroud of the Avatar, which is sort of like a Dante's Inferno of people doing, what hell would be like for people who violate a variety of the core beliefs of the game, and the last level includes an homage to my past, which kind of outdoes them all in a way that I think will take even the most hardened spirits and hopefully crush them just a little.
That's good. I look forward to having my spirits crushed.
Excellent.
But yeah, so thank you very much for your time.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you. And it's great to thank you so much. I mean, it's great to talk about not the usual trappings, but really go dig deep, into what these games are really about.
Yeah, I can talk about it all day long. So unfortunately, our time is limited.
Well,
but thank you.
Absolutely.
Cool. Got it. Thanks so much,
All right.
guys.
Yeah.